From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and coming up today, K-State's Hans Coetzee and Mike Kleinhenz will talk about their ongoing studies of byproducts from industrial hemp as a potential feedstuff for cattle. They'll be evaluating the amount of residual cannabinoid in beef from hemp-fed cattle to determine if this otherwise nutritional feedstuff is safe to use. Then K-State's Dale Blasi will preview the 2020 K-State Beef Stocker Field Day, at which he'll be discussing the topic of limit feeding backgrounder beef calves and the efficiencies it can achieve for producers. He'll elaborate on that. And on this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Jason Griffin on planting landscape trees in the fall. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Good to have you listening in. The question that we'll take up during the first part of today's program, does industrial hemp have a future as a cattle feedstuff? Well, there are so many questions that surround that very question, and they will be hopefully answered in new research that will be conducted here at Kansas State University, largely within the College of Veterinary Medicine. Over from that college is the head of the Anatomy and Physiology Department, Hans Coetzee, and a veterinarian specializing in beef production medicine at K-State, Mike Kleinhenz. Hans, let's go to you first and talk about this in a broad context. This notion of using hemp as a cattle feedstuff, it's an offshoot of the general interest in hemp as a commodity here in Kansas, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct, Derek. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. So we've had an interest in studying what actually happens once we feed hemp to the animals, because there's been a lot of questions about hemp and the cultivation of hemp in Kansas, and in particular, what should we do with the plant material once the CBD oil has been removed from the plant? And so our group developed an interest in that area, and we were fortunate enough to receive some funding from the USDA. It was a $200,000 grant to specifically explore this question about the distribution, absorption, distribution, and metabolism of the cannabinoid component of the hemp material and how that ends up in the animal, and if it ends up in the animal at all, and if it could potentially pose a risk then to the consumer or the end consumer of the animal.
And that really is the nugget, what happens with the cannabinoids. And Mike, what do we know, if anything, about hemp byproducts, to put it this way, and their nutritive value for cattle?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We wanted to look at that from a standpoint of, we know cattle buyers and cattle feeders like to use byproducts as a feed commodity. They usually have a lower cost associated with them. And being ruminants, things that are not available in terms of nutrient value to monogastrics like pigs or horses are readily available to ruminants. And so we looked at that with some partners out of Wisconsin, and we specifically looked at a handful of plant materials and then byproducts from the hemp industry, like byproducts from processing from CBD oil, as well as just chaff and things like that from the regular harvesting processes that are out there.
And what was discovered in those preliminary studies then?
So what we found is cannabinoids are in all parts of the hemp plant, and it's regardless of what the variety was grown for. So there's a number of varieties of hemp that are grown, so for fiber, for CBD, for oil. What we found is we were able to find cannabinoids from our assays in all parts of the plant we could look at. When we looked at it in terms of nutrient value and digestibility, certain parts of them are pretty well digested in ruminants, or what should be, and then also have some pretty good nutrient value in terms of total protein, minerals, and things like that.
What would hemp be comparable to as a feedstuff then? Anything at all?
So it depends on the hemp part. So there's things like hemp meal, which would be similar to like a soybean meal. So it's the leftover from the oil pressings. Then there's other parts that are kind of more novel, which would be the leftovers from the CBD extraction process, which is actually flower material that they extract the CBDs from. And so those have a little bit different nutrient profile and be more along the lines of like an alfalfa meal, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So it has potential in that realm as far as nutrition in and of itself. That's the exciting part about this. But, Hans, it comes back to the cannabinoid residual, if you will. And we need to stress that the FDA does not approve industrial hemp for cattle feeding, and that ought to be pretty clear. But the objective of these studies is to do what exactly?
So long term, we're addressing that need. So specifically the need of the industry to have some way of utilizing the plant material that's left once they've extracted the oil. I guess it's a little like the ethanol industry. You know, we use the corn for ethanol, but the byproduct of that process is then fed to cattle. And we're curious to explore the same opportunities for the hemp industry as well. But this issue of cannabinoids has to be addressed. So we need to stress that the hemp that we begin with has got less than 0.03% of THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, and that would be the addictive component of the plant and one that people would be familiar with. And so that's at a very low level in the plant material we begin with. And so what we're interested in seeing is whether that happens to accumulate in the tissues over time, whether there's a risk that may occur, that could then potentially be a risk to the consumer, and also to look at some of these other cannabinoid components to see whether they end up in the meat at all. So the issue really is trying to address this need to be able to legally utilize hemp plant materials in livestock production. We need to address this question about residues.
You'll have feeding trials, obviously, but Mike, how will you evaluate that cannabinoid residue?
First, we wanted to make sure it was actually absorbed. So our first study we did was we gave them what we would consider would be the worst case scenario, so to speak, in terms of high cannabinoid hemp plant material. And what we found there is it was readily absorbed across the rumen and fairly quickly compared to some pharmaceuticals that are given orally. And so that was the first step, is just to see if it actually ends up in the animal. So now that we know that it ends up in the animal, we have a whole nother litany of questions to ask. Where does it go in terms of the body? Does it stay in the liver, fat, muscle, things like that? And then also, each cannabinoid could almost be considered its own drug, so to speak, in terms of they have their own properties in terms of how they cross the rumen wall. So what we saw, some that were dosed very, very low, actually reached the same concentrations that were of cannabinoids that were dosed up to 10 times higher in terms of a milligram per kilogram basis. So we ended up probably creating more questions and answers, but we at least have a start from where we began with was absolutely no data at all.
So as you have that information in hand, are you going to be looking at potential ways of diffusing the cannabinoids perhaps in some sort of feeding approach? What?
So our first approach is to go and see what happens if we feed this for a long period of time and if there's any ill effects to these animals and if we can pick up any toxicities or anything like that. The second thing we need to accomplish is to determine where these cannabinoids actually go within the body. So we'll have to do a tissue residue study similar to what they do for FDA drug approvals is our plan. And so we'll take samples of the liver, kidney, fat, muscle, and look for cannabinoid tissues and how long they last in the cattle after exposure to that would be our first step. And that'll open the door and allow us to do more research for animals that are out there without having to have a terminal type study.
One of the things you're interested in along that line, the impact on the immune function of the bovine itself?
That is correct. So there's some literature in the human to support immune function within the bovine, and we'd like to elaborate more on that as well. We're going to plan a couple of series of experiments looking at that as well as the therapeutic effects in terms of analgesia that's widespreadly known for CBD and things like that. So there's a whole litany of things to look for.
Hans, what's the general feeling? Will this information perhaps open the door for the use of industrial hemp as a feedstuff for cattle?
I think the data that we're generating will be extremely useful to support the argument that the risk to the consumer, especially of some of the addictive cannabinoids, may be very low. The animals would have to receive a considerable amount of hemp over an extended period of time for that to be a risk. But we won't know that until we've completed this research. But once we can answer that question, I think that would really provide a level of support to the industry that they haven't previously had in being able to understand what the risks are, and if those can be mitigated, perhaps through incorporating hemp as a component of the feed, not as a standalone feed, that would result then in the dilution of these actives to the point where they no longer are accumulating in the animal to the extent where they might pose a risk. So I think this is a part of informing the discussion about the use of hemp as a component of feed, potentially as a source of protein or other enrichments of the feed that could help producers to economically feed cattle here in the state of Kansas and beyond.
And this will take a little time. It won't be the next day or the next month. This will be over a couple of years or so, likely.
Yeah, we're expecting certainly this fall to continue some of the feeding trials that we've started, and we have specifically the repeated dosage study that's planned, and then that'll lead then into the tissue residue study, so looking at the drug concentrations in the different tissues, and then finally we plan to do a milk residue study as well to look at these components in the milk for the dairy industry. So those are the different pieces of this project, and I would say within a year or two we should have a very nice data set that we can share with the industry.
Well, it is a multifaceted study already underway here at K-State with many more angles to explore, and it ought to render some highly interesting information for the cattle industry and those interested as well in growing industrial hemp as a cash crop with the potential of using the byproducts from that crop as a cattle feedstuff. So, Hans and Mike, we wish you the best as you chase down these answers. Thank you very much for letting us know about your work right here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They're over from the College of Veterinary Medicine here at Kansas State University. Hans Coetzee is the head of the Anatomy and Physiology Department there, and veterinarian, again specializing in beef production medicine, Mike Kleinhenz. They're the principals involved in this research on industrial hemp and its potential as a cattle feed ingredient. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today is back now on the K-State Radio Network. Well, we're taking a few minutes here to glance ahead to an annual event of high importance to cattle producers here in the state of Kansas. It'll be the 21st edition of the Beef Stalker Field Day out of Kansas State University. And as is seemingly the case with everything this year, it'll be done in a different kind of format. Joining us once again is beef cattle specialist Dale Blasi, K-State Research and Extension, who organizes this program every year. Dale will put it out there up front that this will be a virtual field day. That's just the reality of things, but you're going to make a game effort of it to get good information out to producers nonetheless.
That's right, Eric. We had no choices. Our backs were up against the wall, and we're following the rules, and we abbreviated the program significantly to allow folks for 2.5 hours to get basically the latest and greatest information that we can provide to our stakeholders out there.
And that is in keeping with the tradition of this field day. 21 years, it's gone by very fast, but what is the intent of putting this on every year, Dale?
Well, for many years, the backgrounding and stalker segment of our beef industry, they're a very hard segment to follow. They're very fluid, transient. K-State has had a lot of great work done in the past, mostly down in the southeast. Dr. Brazel's leadership when he was on board, and this institution needed to have an emphasis on backgrounding cattle because of the connections between this segment and our dominant feedlot industry. in the state.
It's a vibrant part of the system here in the state of Kansas, there's no doubt. And that's why you pull together expertise every year for this program, which will be done online Thursday, October the 1st. Let's walk through the program, if we might, for a brief moment here, Dale. Largely K-State expertise on it, but with an emphasis on a variety of topics, right?
That's correct. And one of our mainstays in the program for many years now, Dr. Glenn Tonser over in Ag Economics. And Glenn will have an interesting perspective with the fallout that we've experienced over the last 6 months, and certainly looking forward into the future. I'm looking forward to his remarks and what information and data that has been generated to give our listeners an opportunity to gain a feel for what's going to happen with our economy and our beef industry and how we move forward.
So Glenn will be featured once again with the beef cattle market outlook, but he'll also be instrumental in another part of the program, which we'll talk of at greater length here in just a second. Your colleague Justin Wagner of K-State will be on that program as well, and he'll be looking at changing ration ingredients and how to make those work.
Again, related to the COVID situation with respect to the ethanol plants shutting down and the lack of distillers' grains, a lot of folks were scrambling, trying to figure out alternative approaches to building rations. I mean, trying to make things as good as they were with the distillers' grains in the ration. And so Justin's going to take a look at that, provide some alternatives, give folks some ideas on what works and what may not work.
And there are alternatives out there.
There are, and there's manipulations of the diet that you can to try to provide the texture of the diet in the bunk, and Dr. Wagner will address those issues.
So those two topics, the beef cattle market outlook and making alternative ration ingredient changes for that backgrounder ration, will take up the first part of the program. The second part, you will team up with Glenn Tonser to talk specifically about limit feeding calves. We want to talk more in detail about that, Dale. What's the impetus behind this?
Well, the impetus behind limit feeding is that what we've determined from our research starting in 2016, that if we utilize 40% of a co-product, whether it's wet corn gluten feed or even distillers' grains, that we can reduce the amount of roughage in the diet from 45% downwards to 13 to 14% of the diet. In lieu of the fact that the state of Kansas is in some state of drought, we're dealing with drought-like situations where we are dealing with roughages that are higher priced, in demand, and it's just a challenge. Roughages are marginally digestible. You know, we take 1 pound of a roughage, and it's equal to about 2 pounds of corn, if you look at it from a TDM perspective. What we have found with limit feeding, and it's certainly not a new concept. I don't want to give the listeners the impression that we can hang our hat on the fact that limit feeding was invented at K-State, because it certainly was not. We've just taken it and have refined it and basically have concluded that we can get calves started on feed and grow them in a stepwise manner using NRC equations. And in the meantime, we can improve feed efficiency by 27 to 30%, and also reduce the output of manure by about 45%, with no implicit impact on calf health, but it certainly does help from a cost of gain perspective.
And the gains hold up, apparently.
The gains are predictable. I mean, NRC equations are time-proven. The nutritionists in our industry today rely on them heavily for cattle type, cattle sex, desired rate of gain. Those formulas work very accurately. It's the best that we have to make the system work.
And you're looking at a variety of feedstuffs as candidates for limit feeding in this?
Yes, we have. We've evaluated over the last 3 years wet corn gluten feed, or sweet bran, out of Nebraska. And we've also evaluated distillers' grains, too, with no significant differences in performance between either type. Our next steps are to evaluate various roughage substitutes, whether we use a total of 13% prairie hay and completely remove the alfalfa contribution that is in the diet. But, Eric, what we found this last year was we followed a set of calves that we backgrounded, and they went directly into the commercial feedlot that we work with. And our concern was to look at eating behavior, if there was any impact on dry matter consumption from a calf that had been limit-fed previously. We found no significant differences in dry matter intake, and more importantly, in the meat, we saw no significant impacts on liver abscess scores, which would be indicative of subacute acidosis and so forth, but there was no significant differences between those calves that were either limit-fed or ad lib, a traditional backgrounding diet, and in the subsequent feeding phase that we observed.
And presumably then very few ill effects as far as the finishing capability of those.
Right. And the beautiful thing about limit feeding, especially when we're feeding at 60 megacals per 100 pounds, we are able to get those cattle, if you will, conditioned to eating a higher energy-dense diet. And one thing we didn't look at, and I think it's something that needs to be evaluated down the road, is if we can shave off a week to 10 days on the finishing period in terms of stepping cattle up to a full-fed final finisher diet, if you will. I think there's great opportunities. Those cattle have already been conditioned in the rumen. The eating behavior is there. It just takes coordination between the respective feedlot nutritionists and the manner in which those cattle were fed in the backgrounding phase.
Really intriguing to see this unfold, and you'll be talking about the nutrition and management side of limit feeding at the Beef Stocker Field Day. And then Glenn Tonser will follow up with the numbers on the economic side.
Exactly. I mean, the operational efficiencies, when you're mixing 45 versus 13% of the roughage in a mixer wagon, your mixing time is dramatically reduced. You're also able to mix a greater amount. So in terms of labor time, in terms of tractor hour time, and the total amount of time to feed is dramatically reduced with respect to limit feeding.
Well, there'll be a thorough look at this option of managing calf rations by way of limit feeding as a key part of the Beef Stocker Field Day coming up on Thursday, October the 1st, virtually. So how do producers take part in the entire program, Dale?
Well, it's free, Eric, and we ask that folks go to ksubeef.org. There's an article, a short article on the homepage there. You scroll to the bottom, and there's a direct link to a Zoom registration. And I encourage people to register for Zoom because we are going to be providing some pretty nice, pretty cool door prizes that I promise we will get mailed to the subsequent winners. But it's really painless, Eric.
Mm-hmm. Keeping that tradition of door prizes intact.
We have to do
all
that.
Of this, you bet.
We have to do that.
Very well. Once again, it's as easy as going to ksubeef.org and register for the free program, which will be conducted online via Zoom the morning of Thursday, October the 1st, starting with the initial welcome and overview of the program at 9:30, followed by the subjects that we detailed for you here visiting with Dale. ksubeef.org. That's how to make the Beef Stocker Field Day 2020 part of your agenda. Producers, do take advantage of it, and the best of luck with it, Dale. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Dale Blasi coordinates the field day every year. He's a beef cattle specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Get it on your calendar, beef producers, for the morning of Thursday, October the 1st. And we'll have more for you after these moments away. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA releases its September crop production report tomorrow. Based on field data for the first time this year, it'll provide corn and soybean crop estimates that'll likely set a tone for the rest of the year. Back on August the 12th, the USDA estimated the corn crop to be 15.2 billion bushels and U.S. ending corn stocks of 2.7 billion bushels. That report did not account for the derecho, which swept across Iowa and into neighboring states. At the same time, much of the Corn Belt turned hot and dry, sapping moisture from crops at a time that they would be normally filling out. Now, as for what the trade is thinking, the pre-report survey of analysts by Dow Jones expects the USDA to reduce the U.S. corn crop estimate down to 14.8 billion bushels, based on a national yield of 177 bushels per acre. And they're thinking the ending stocks estimate would be at 2.4 billion bushels. That would be roughly 17% of annual use. Dow Jones survey expects the USDA to reduce its estimate of world-ending corn stocks from 317.5 million metric tons in August down to 310, largely due to the changes anticipated here in the U.S. No major changes expected for South American estimates. As with corn, soybean supply estimates are also expected to be reduced after a month of dry weather and active export sales. The Dow Jones survey is looking for the USDA's soybean crop estimate to come down from 4.4 billion bushels in August to 4.2 billion bushels, based on a lower yield of 51.5 bushels per acre. The USDA's estimates of U.S. ending soybean stocks also expected to be adjusted lower from 610 million bushels in August down to 461 million bushels, or roughly 11% of annual use. And from a world perspective, the Dow Jones survey is looking for a small decline in USDA's world soybean stocks estimate from 95 million metric tons to 93 million metric tons. So far, the forecast for Brazil remains dry. Planting there has not yet started. And just noting on the wheat side, the Dow Jones survey is expecting the USDA to slightly lower its estimate of world-ending wheat stocks, but very slightly so, around 316 million metric tons. Of course, K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien will be along with us tomorrow. He will offer his expectations of that USDA crop production and supply and demand report just minutes before it comes out, as he talks with us here on the broadcast again tomorrow. President Trump reportedly has ordered the EPA to reject 67 so-called gap year small refinery exemption requests to the renewable fuels standard. The EPA received those requests for retroactive waivers for 2011 to 2018 after the Trump administration decided not to appeal a January 2020 ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit in Denver. That court ruled the EPA mishandled 3 waivers granted to small refineries. In addition, CVR Refining and Holly Frontier Corporation on September the 4th filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking for a review of that 10th Circuit ruling. The Trump administration did not file an appeal to the Supreme Court before the deadline. Quoting here, the Renewable Fuels Association, National Corn Growers Association, National Farmers Union, and American Coalition for Ethanol in a statement yesterday, we are encouraged by reports that President Trump has called upon the EPA to reject these gap year waiver petitions out of hand. Back on January the 24th, the 10th Circuit ruled the EPA did not have the authority to issue small refinery exemption extensions to 3 refiners that were not originally granted waivers in 2017 and 2018. The court also found the EPA abused its discretion by not explaining its conclusion that a small refinery could suffer disproportionate economic hardship while also maintaining that refiners passed on renewable fuel standard compliance costs to consumers at the pump. And the coming coronavirus food assistance expansion by the USDA is closer to being announced. The final rule was sent to the Office of Management and Budget for review last Friday. Expectations are that that effort will be announced very soon as that review is finalized. Coming your way now is this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Sarah Lancaster, K-State Extension Assistant Professor and Weed Scientist, joins us. And Sarah, the time is here once again to talk about the 2020 Kansas Soybean Yield and Value Contest, which is open and free of charge to any soybean grower in Kansas.
This is a great opportunity for farmers to maybe exercise their competitive side and see how their soybean production practices stack up against their neighbors and other farmers across the state.
Now, the entries must be postmarked by December 1st of this year?
That is correct. Entries need to be postmarked by December 1st. You need to make sure that you have someone who is sort of a judge present when you harvest your field. A good person to contact for that would be your county extension agent.
And only one entry per field will be accepted?
That is correct. We have not changed the rules this year, so the categories are for yield and for value. Those each are for conventional till and no-till.
And Sarah, the entries will be based on the typical crop reporting district areas that we have in the state?
There are 8 different districts, so kind of grouped according to expected yield potential in each of those areas. So there's an extreme north-northeast district, a northeast district, an east-central district, a southeast district, a south-central district, a north-central district, northwest, and southwest. So you'll just have to find your county and see where it fits into those districts. So those rules, you can find the map with those districts and other contest rules on the Kansas Soybean website.
And there's cash prizes involved in this, too.
Absolutely. We can't have a contest without some rewards, right, or some awards. So first place award is $300, second place $200, and third place is $100. In addition, if you have the overall highest yield, you'll get an extra $1,000.
They're also looking at trying to break that previous high yield, which is we got above 100, 104.14 bushels. They get an extra added bonus, too.
That's right. So theoretically, a person could walk away from this with $2,300 in their pocket.
If people want more information or like to get the rules and how they need to enter and what they need to enter, they can just go to the website?
That's right. Another good thing to do would be to contact the Kansas Soybean office at 877-577-6923.
That is Sarah Lancaster, K-State Extension Assistant Professor and Weed Scientist, talking about the 2020 Kansas Soybean Yield and Value Contest as she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're around now to time here on Agriculture Today for our weekly horticulture segment. And our guest now will strongly endorse the option of planting landscape trees here in the fall. Jason Griffin is with us. Jason is based at the John C. Pear Horticulture Center just outside of Wichita. He's an ornamental horticulturist for the university. And Jason, we really don't have to prompt you all that much for reasons why the fall is an excellent time to put in a new landscape tree.
Yes, it is. And thanks again for having me, Eric. Appreciate that. Yeah, we've all heard the overused cliche that fall is for planting. And it's one of those things that it's not just a cliche. It's actually based in science. Probably the main reason for planting in fall is your job as a tree planter or tree grower or horticulturist is to get roots on that new tree that you've planted, to produce roots. And roots grow in 2 primary seasons. They grow in the spring and they grow in the fall. They don't do much growing in the winter. They don't do much growing in the summer. So spring and fall is your target. So if you plant now, if you plant this fall, your tree, newly planted tree, gets 1 season of root growth, goes dormant, gets another season of root growth before Kansas unleashes its summer on it. So 2 seasons of root growth before it hits heat and drought. And that's really a big thing for new trees to get that root growth on them.
And that root growth can be substantial in the fall because, for one thing, soil temperatures are warm enough to encourage it.
Right. We got still nice warm soil temperatures still, cool air, so the plants aren't stressed very much, and they put on a lot of root growth. Yep. You know, the other reason for fall planting is your local nursery retailer may be sitting on some inventory that they brought in the spring, and they might be a little more inclined to let that go this fall, so they don't have to store it over the winter. But don't tell them I said that.
Bargains, potentially. Bargains. Speaking of plant material, though, selecting the right material, not only species, but cultivars suitable for our growing conditions in Kansas. And one has to pay particular attention to that, don't they?
Yes, they do. It is that time of year. The catalogs are coming in those glossy, beautiful pictures. They just want to make you want to buy everything. But it's really important to know what you're getting and whether or not it's adapted to Kansas or even your part of Kansas. Fortunately, K-State Research and Extension has lots of information out there for you. Just, look up our recommended plant list and you can find them out there. And every year, it's a big deal. Nurseries race to put out the latest, greatest, newest cultivars. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're no better than the standard. But again, it's a really fun time of year to look at the catalogs and see what you might want to try. Again, check with your local research extension expert and see if it makes sense.
Or go online to the horticulture website out of K-State. You can tap into all of that. Well, briefly here, what new things have caught your attention in as far as cultivars that will hopefully thrive in Kansas?
Some of the newer ones out there, there's some new maples on the market, which are really nice. A lot of them have been promoted for improved heat and drought tolerance, which is good for us. There are some new oaks on the market as well. And of course, oaks do really well for us here in Kansas for the most part. But there are some really nice new cultivars out there. They flush with a new leaf color, red leaf color, or the fall colors improved. But definitely the oaks and maples are really exciting right now.
That is not a limited list. There are so many other species that will work in our Kansas landscapes, our home settings. So
that's for sure.
Shop well. Now, technique, briefly here, Jason, as far as making this tree planting succeed. And so much of it is in the site preparation, isn't it?
It is site preparation. One of the things we really need to do, we're focusing on that root growth. And those new roots are young, tender. They're not really good at breaking into hard soil. So we recommend digging a nice wide hole, backfilling with a loose soil, not digging a deep hole. Those roots want to grow wide, not deep. Forget about that old picture in your head of the root system looking like a mirror image of the top. It is not. That tree sitting on top of a pancake for a root system. It's wide, wide, wide. And we want to make sure those roots can grow wide. So nice wide hole with some good soil in it. If you're working in a new home construction or a new site, that construction soil is one of the worst things you can try and plant in. So again, do your homework, get your soil tested if you need to, but make sure those roots are trying to grow into a nice, loose, fertile soil.
When you speak of soil quality, it's about organic content and the ability of those roots to capitalize on nutrient and such in that soil?
It's all about airspace. When it comes to new root growth, it's all about airspace. And one of the best ways to do that, to get good airspace, is to incorporate organic matter, which fortunately comes with lots of nutrient holding capacity, lots of moisture holding capacity. So it helps out all the way around.
And if one has any doubts about how wide that hole should be, isn't there an old rule of thumb concerning the width of the root ball itself?
Absolutely. We try to dig the hole at least twice as wide as the root ball. If you can go 3 times as wide, that's great. But at least twice as wide as root ball.
All right, then. What about handling that new tree as one's putting it in? Any special considerations there, Jason?
Well, there's a couple different ways you're going to get that tree from your nursery. You can get it as B&B, balled and burlap. So that is going to be a larger tree usually. And it's going to have a ball of soil from the nursery wrapped in burlap. And they are heavy. There's no way around it. They are heavy.
Prepare accordingly.
Yeah, that's right. Give your neighbor's kid a few bucks to help you get it out of the back of your truck so you don't hurt yourself.
Right.
You dig that hole wide and just be gentle. You don't want to break the root ball. You don't want to drop it. You don't want to do anything to fracture that root ball. Or you can get your trees in a container, which are much lighter. It's usually a smaller tree. It's much easier to handle, but it doesn't have any soil per se. It's usually pine bark and peat moss that's in there, but much easier to handle.
Yeah. So you obtain the tree, you place it upright in that hole, then you backfill with soil, and lastly, mulching that newly planted tree. Is that an essential here?
It absolutely is. Yeah, put a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch right around that tree. Cover the root system. That's your goal. Just sort of like an insulation blanket over the root system, helping retain moisture, helping with the organic matter, helps alleviate temperature fluctuations. does a lot of good things for the tree. So 2 to 3 inches thick over the root system, but not against the trunk of the tree.
Do check out that list of information on cultivars suitable for Kansas through your local extension office or at the horticulture website out of K-State. As always, Jason, thanks for the input. We'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Ornamental horticulturist Jason Griffin from the John C. Pear Horticulture Center, Kansas State University, manages near Wichita. Some tips on fall landscape tree planting on this week's horticulture segment. And our time is away once again. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.